Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate the time you're taking out of your busy schedules to learn a little bit more about this topic. It occurred to me as I was pulling this information together just how much, what a wealth of information there is out there on habitat rehabilitation enhancement projects. You know, we've been doing these under the UMRR program for over 30 years, and I tried to do the best I can to do that topic justice, but there is just so much to be learned about this topic. This webinar is really just a simple overview of kind of how those that part of the UMRR program came to be through our authority, what the purpose of those habitat rehabilitation enhancement projects are. Want to touch a little bit on sponsorship. You know, we don't do this in a vacuum as the Corps of Engineers. It happens in partnership and with sponsors from across the upper Mississippi River Valley. And then I wanted to spend a little bit of time just kind of giving you an overview of, you know, kind of how do these projects from the initial stages of development through construction and then operations and maintenance, what does that look like? And what are some of the steps in that process? And then finally, and then also to give you a sense of what the current activities are ongoing in each of the 3 river reaches in the upper Miss, and then finally just some resources that you can tap into if you're interested in this topic further. And then finally, we'll open it up for questions on the phone and via the chat. So that's the roadmap for the next little bit. So we'll go ahead and move right into it. Just by way of background, this program really got started. It was the combination of a lot of efforts by resource managers up and down the river, by the public and interested stakeholders throughout the 1960s and 70s that ultimately led to the Water Resources Development Act of 1986, and in that Congress recognized the upper Mississippi River system as a nationally significant commercial navigation system as well as an ecosystem. And in order to better serve that dual recognition, the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program was authorized, and it really has 2 components. One, the long-term resource monitoring element, which we'll be having a webinar here next week on that topic specifically, and then today's topic, of course, habitat rehabilitation and enhancement projects, or HREPs. Just what everyone wants to read on a Tuesday afternoon is language from a law, but this really is what is kind of the heart and soul of what we do in HREPs. Congress gave us the authority as a partnership to plan, design, construct, and evaluate projects for fish and wildlife habitat restoration across the upper Mississippi River system. And that, you know, to be honest, that was the first large river ecosystem restoration authority given to the Corps of Engineers, and we have over the last 32 years been very successful in implementing this program, in large part due to the partnership that we have. So at the most basic level, what's our purpose in HREP projects? Well, to blow it up at a big level, as I mentioned just a minute ago, this is a nationally and internationally significant ecosystem with a wide variety of resources, fish and wildlife resources, threatened and endangered species. It contributes greatly to the economy of the upper Midwest, and so that from that significance, we start on this journey of why we do HREPs. But we also need to recognize that there have been changes in the system, the upper Mississippi River system, up and down the Mississippi and Illinois rivers over the last 75 years due to a number of things. The navigation system obviously plays a role in the changes that have occurred in the system. that have changed the ecosystem structure and function over time. We've had invasive species become a dominant driver in the system. Erosion and sedimentation off the landscape and increased flows from tributaries have changed how the river functions. And then, of course, we also have an emerging threat, so to speak, or a stressor, the impacts of climate change. And so you can kind of see here in this example on the right-hand side in Pool 8 some of the changes that have occurred from the late 1800s to the 2000s, in this case primarily driven by impoundment of the river for navigation purposes, but then those excessive sediment loads, those other impacts to water quality have really changed the landscape along the river, and again have altered the structure, function, and processes that support healthy habitats. And so ultimately our objective is, through these HREP projects, is to address some of those stressors and to make adjustments on the landscape that promote a healthier and more resilient ecosystem as a result of our projects. Just another example here from the Illinois River. You can kind of see on the left there. This is actually land cover from the Government Land Office records from the 1810s, 1815. And you can see the dramatic change to 2000 there on the right, where we have an impounded system, a fragmented system, in excess of 5 to 6 feet of water are placed on that landscape, and it fundamentally alters the habitat that's there. And so with the program, we have the ability, the area that we have to work in is pretty extensive. It's of course the main stem of the Mississippi River and Illinois rivers and navigable portions of the Kaskaskia, St. Croix, and Minnesota rivers. This is generally, in addition to this, the length of this 1,200 river miles, we have the floodplain essentially to work with as well, kind of toe-to-toe of the river bluff, so to speak, in terms of the area that we're dealing with. In total, about 2.7 million acres that we have available to work in. Some of the, that didn't work out too well. Some of the tools that we have available to us in terms of project restoration features that we have put on the ground in some places, island creation and or protection, where we have island complexes that are eroding away, that habitat's being lost. Oftentimes the side channels associated with those island complexes are being lost as well. So we look at opportunities to either restore islands in their entirety or protect existing islands that are there. Various types of dredging for overwintering habitat is a common feature amongst our HREP projects. In other cases, we're building structures such as you see on the lower left there to influence how water and sediment and nutrients move within a project area for the benefit of a particular area, or to keep those excess resources out of the project area for habitat purposes. Over on the right, you'll see pump stations, and in several cases we've looked at particular areas where the water level management, the water levels are not supporting a healthy variety of habitats, and so we work to elevate or degrade certain areas in order to manage those water levels better. Sometimes we can do that by with structures that allow water to flow into the site that doesn't currently get to the site, or we use mechanical pumping to put water on project sites at particular times of the year, or drain sites at particular times of the year for habitat benefit. One of the areas, one of the additional areas that we're just kind of starting to get into in terms of techniques, and this is just a small sampling, we're starting to look at the potential for water level management, how we operate our dams, is there an opportunity there for environmental benefit as part of an HREP project? We're looking at one right now in Pool 13 of the Mississippi River that will take a look at that opportunity to restore some more natural water levels during particular times of the year. So some of the common, and this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but some of the common HREP goals and objectives that have been developed on a project basis over the years include the things that you see here. Increasing or restoring habitat for waterfowl. I mentioned earlier, overwintering fish habitat is one that is seen in a great many of our projects. Increased emergent and submergent and floating aquatic vegetation. That has been very successful in the upper parts of the river. That Pool 8 project that I showed you earlier has a project that has been very successful at accomplishing that. And we're starting some other things that we're starting to look at in great detail on a number of our active projects, say in the last 10 years or so, is working to enhance and restore the forest diversity. All those impoundments and fluctuations in water levels kind of play havoc with forest diversity and their ability to regenerate over time. And so we're looking, several of our projects currently in construction and being planned are looking at how do we better manage those forest resources that we have. And then I also mentioned earlier island protection and restoration is some of the example goals and objectives that we've had across HREPs. You know, those things are all really happening at the project level, but ultimately they're intended to support a vision for the program. And that vision is spelled out in our strategic plan that the UMRR Coordinating Committee worked very hard to develop along with other folks in the partnership a few years ago. And it really, what it calls for, and you can see this here in the vision, a healthier and more resilient upper Mississippi River ecosystem that sustains the river's multiple uses. At the end of the day, that's where we're driving towards, and these HREP projects play a pretty key role in doing that. They do that in partnership and integrated with the long-term resource monitoring element of the program so that we can better understand what changes are occurring and how are we doing with accomplishing that vision. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about sponsorship. As I said earlier, all these projects don't happen in a vacuum. They cannot happen in a vacuum for a variety of reasons, but ultimately we plan and develop these projects in partnership. One of the I guess the more unique aspects of being a partner includes being a sponsor on an HREP project. We have a variety of folks that have been sponsors on projects. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the Upper Miss Refuges have been, I think about 70% of our HREP projects have been sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Each of the 5 states have also participated in select HREP projects over the years. We have taken steps in the past to get non-governmental organizations involved in HREP planning. We had some work with the Nature Conservancy a few years ago at their Emaquan site that was ultimately didn't go forward as an HREP project, but has since been constructed, and there's a lot of great things happening there. We also have the opportunity to work with municipalities and counties as well as tribes. Those sponsorship relationships are a little different than, say, working with the federal government or the state, but there are opportunities for those groups to work with us, work with the Corps, and work with the partnership on HREP projects. Part of, and cost sharing really applies to every kind of Corps of Engineers project. In particular with UMRR, we're a little unique in that projects that are on Fish and Wildlife refuges or federal lands tend to be projects that can be planned, designed, and constructed at 100% federal costs. If there are one of the unique elements, a couple of unique elements of sponsorship are the ability to acquire additional lands, easements, and right-of-ways for the project if that's necessary, or to conduct operation, maintenance, rehabilitation, repair, and replacement after the project is built. And so for projects on federal lands or refuges, those projects are 100% cost, federal in terms of cost, so there is essentially no cost share with a non-federal sponsor. Any additional lands that might need to be acquired for that project are the responsibility of that other federal partner. And then the operations and maintenance of the project after it's constructed is typically a federal responsibility. In a lot of cases, in most cases, the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly on their refuges, are taking that responsibility on. Or in cases where we have projects with, say, the states that have a management role on some of those lands, the states will take on that responsibility. For projects where we have state lands or local lands that are being brought to the table, we have a cost sharing of 65% federal, 35% non-federal for the whole process, the planning, the design, and construction. And that's the same across the Corps of Engineers for all of our ecosystem restoration missions. For the lands that are required, additional lands that would be required for a project, those non-federal sponsors, say a state or an NGO, have to be able to bring those to the table for the project. And they do get credit for those as part of that cost share. It counts towards that 35%. But they do have to have that ability to get those lands. And then finally, once the project is constructed, the operations and maintenance responsibility is turned over to that non-federal sponsor. So I want to move just kind of into an overview of start to finish how HREPs are put together and work through the process. But I wanted to give you just a brief idea of kind of where these projects come from. For the last 30 years, we've had a process by which HREP projects are planned and sequenced within the program across, that 1,200 river miles that we were talking about earlier. And that process really seeks to optimize the kind of investments we're making. We have limited dollars within the program, and within that limited pot of funds, we have some going to HREP and some going to LTRM and some going to some other programmatic things. And so that the process that we've used in the past really seeks to try to identify the best projects that are out there and move those forward. And we're in the process right now of kind of getting ready to do the next iteration of that. We have what we're looking to do over the next, from June till December of this year, is work with our partners to identify kind of the future HREP needs for, say, the next 5 years. The studies, the projects that we would like to see move into a feasibility study phase and then on into design and construction. As I said, that process is going to take place in the latter half of this calendar year. We look to, and I'll explain who the river teams are in a second, but we look to that to be a collaborative process between our partners and our sponsors. And also, we just completed last year a habitat needs assessment document, a couple of documents actually, that really have helped us as a partnership think through what are the ecological indicators that we're most interested in as a partnership and we'd like to see some improvements on. And so those are going to be considered as part of this next round of projects. Just to give you an organizational view of where that work is going to happen at, you see down on the bottom right in the green box the district river teams. there are river teams essentially for each of the geographic areas of the system. The upper Mississippi River system up and corresponds to the St. Paul district's boundaries, and then we have ones for Rock Island and St. Louis as well. And the Illinois River is covered in those lower two, and that's really where that project identification and development initially occurs. And then ultimately that works, once those teams have done their work and make some recommendations, the program as a whole will make some decisions in consultation with the coordinating committee, which is essentially all of our state and federal partners, about which projects should move forward over that time frame that I mentioned earlier. So what I want to spend a few minutes talking about now is kind of this, once a project has been identified by the river teams and it's been moved through the process to start a feasibility study, I want to talk through kind of each of the steps in that and try and give you a little bit more detail on from project initiation through the feasibility phase, who's reviewing these reports and giving us an okay to move them into design and construction, and then talk a little bit about those design and construction phases, and then finish up with a few thoughts on the operations and maintenance. As I go through these, where I've tried to, where our sponsors and partners have a unique opportunity to provide input are some decision points, and I've italicized and underlined those in a couple of these slides just for emphasis. So if folks are asking questions, either you are a sponsor or you're talking with folks who are thinking about being sponsors. I wanted to highlight some of those. So just real quick, there's quite a few steps to get from an initial project proposal or a fact sheet all the way through construction and operations and maintenance. And so I put together this graphic to kind of illustrate those 6 major steps, but they're kind of broken down into some smaller things. And so obviously we have a project initiation phase, and then as we move into feasibility phase, and I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail here in a second. But I wanted to give you a sense of the big picture. Once the feasibility phase is completed and we have a recommended plan, there's a lot of review that goes into getting a project approved, and so I want to give you some insight into what that looks like. And then also, once that happens, we move into the design phase of the project, developing the contract documents and so forth, and then into project's implementation and construction, and then wrapping that up finally with the operations and maintenance phase of the project. So I just want to give you a few highlights from each of those phases so you can kind of see what's going on in those. In that initial, that first part of the process, I mentioned earlier there's groups that are going to be working later this year to develop project proposals. Those ultimately result in project fact sheets that get approved by the Corps of Engineers and the UMRR coordinating committee. That allows us to start into feasibility, to start this project initiation. And what those fact sheets, have are very basic. They're kind of a first iteration of the project planning. Where's the project? What are the existing resources and problems that we hope to address with the HREP project? What are some potential goals that we might hope to achieve as a result of the project? What are some project features that might help us get there? Some financial data, just kind of some basic level of understanding for the project. Just kind of the first attempt at scoping out what this particular HREP might look like. Also in that initiation phase, that's really where we stand up, within the Corps we call it the project delivery team, but what that really means is it's the group of folks, both Corps and composed of our partners as well as our sponsors, who are going to work together as a team to make decisions about how this project's going to develop over time. And so that can be a pretty wide-ranging group depending on the project, and it's different in almost every HREP project. A couple of other things that we put together is a project management plan. And really what that is a scope of work. It says, here's the things that we're going to do as part of this feasibility study to get to, to identify some alternatives to address the problems at this particular project site. How long are we going to take to do it? Kind of the nuts and bolts of how do we get from a 1 or 2 page fact sheet to a complete feasibility report that makes a good argument for why we should be investing dollars in habitat restoration at a particular site. This is really important because this is where the views and considerations of our sponsors and stakeholders and partners really need to be taken into account, because that's going to drive a lot of the things that are done during feasibility. Also, as part of this, there's what we call a review plan. This is required under federal law. It basically says how are we going to, we're not just going to go develop this document in a vacuum. It's going to be part of a larger effort to give the public an opportunity to review this document and the decisions that we're proposing to make, as well as our agency partners. When we move into the feasibility phase itself, the feasibility study, there's a number of steps here which I think a lot of you might be familiar with as the core 6-step planning process. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second and give you kind of an example from one of the feasibility studies that we have going on right now. But really the whole purpose of the feasibility report is to formulate and evaluate alternatives that address the problems that have been identified, the habitat problems that have been identified at a particular site, and to make a recommendation for action. Even though Congress has told us, yes, you can go plan, design, and build these things, we still have to go through a process and get some approval on what that course of action might be. And so that's really what the feasibility report is. It's that decision document that then allows us to move forward with construction. And so we're going to document all the analysis and evaluation that we do. It's always integrated with a NEPA document, usually an environmental assessment. And because it's a feasibility document, the level of detail is fairly limited, although in some cases where we've got a lot of existing information, whether it be from LTRM or other efforts, we would incorporate that into the feasibility as we go along. But the level of design for what we come up with is usually around 35%. We're describing, what are the environmental outputs? Back to that goals and objectives slide that I talk about. Well, what is our particular project going to do to contribute to those goals and objectives? And we do the best we can to quantify those things. And then any other environmental or social impacts that the project may have. Most of our projects are very low impact in terms of almost never do we have any sort of adverse environmental impact, and we seek to avoid social impacts. And then, of course, we also talk about cost. The two big things there, environmental outputs and costs, those are some things that we use quite a bit to help make some determination or to discern differences between different alternatives of a particular project. As I said earlier, those steps that you saw in the last graphic correspond to our the core 6-step planning process. There are I think every agency and a lot of our NGOs and other partners have similar processes for decision making. So this isn't unique to the Corps. This is just the requirements that we have as an agency when we do water resources projects. I want to put that in context a little bit using an existing project that we have that's currently in feasibility phase. This one here you see is at Steamboat Island. This is in primarily in Scott County, Iowa, with a bit of the project in Rock Island County, Illinois. It's about 20 miles upriver of the Quad Cities. It is managed as part of the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is our sponsor. We do have the state of Illinois and the state of Iowa as partners in this. They're on the team helping us, but the Fish and Wildlife Service is the sponsor. So ultimately they're the ones, if we get to a recommendation for construction, we'll be taking on the responsibility for operations and maintenance going forward. And so during that feasibility phase, we're doing a number of things. I'm not going to read all these, but the idea is to begin, the team begins with scoping the study, trying to figure out what existing conditions exist, kind of refining what's found in that fact sheet that I showed you earlier. And what they're really driving towards is trying to determine, well, what happens if we don't do anything? If these resources are degraded in a particular project site and we do nothing, what happens? And then from there, they begin to formulate those goals and objectives that I showed you earlier. And a lot of that existing information comes from our partners, particularly when we're dealing with refuge sites. The service has been managing these for quite a while, so there's an existing information there. The long-term resource monitoring element of the program also can inform that initial baseline set of information that's being put together. There's some preliminary engineering being done on the sites to help think through what potential project features there might be. And ultimately, once the team decides on what those features are, they go through an evaluation process based on a number of different factors. You see those there. As I mentioned earlier, the environmental benefits and costs figure in quite heavily. Ultimately, we do what's called a cost-effectiveness incremental cost analysis. That's probably a whole webinar in and of itself. But the purpose of that is to differentiate amongst alternatives and try and discern which one are most cost-effective at providing the environmental benefits that we want. And ultimately, with all that evaluation that happens, the team sits down and they walk through those alternatives and make some decisions about what a recommended plan might look like. Some other things that are going on during that time frame, during that feasibility report, is laying out even though we've been doing these projects for a long time, there's always opportunities to learn, as well as minimize some of the risk and uncertainty that comes with any sort of investment like this. And so the team's working through a monitoring and adaptive management strategy. What will success look like, and then if we're not achieving that success, what are some things that we could do maybe post-construction to help achieve the goals and objectives of the project. And then of course we're also doing all the NEPA things that we need to do, our permits, and as well as coordination with our other federal agencies. And then ultimately we end up with a final cost estimate for that tentatively selected plan. So going back to the steamboat example that I mentioned earlier, at this site, the problem identification is pretty straightforward. We have excess silt deposition on the site that's impacting both the forest resources as well as some of the side channels in and around the island complex. The impoundment of the river itself has raised the water table. That has had a pretty dramatic effect on the forest resources there, as well as other species. And then island loss, we have issues with islands eroding and what that means for the associated habitat. And so the goals and objectives are really intended to address those problems, restoring that forest diversity and function, improving the aquatic habitats that have been lost due to sedimentation, protecting those islands, and then where we have opportunities to protect and enhance some backwater and interior wetland areas. And so once those goals and objectives have been identified, the team works to put together project features to address those items specifically. Maybe you can read the descriptions on the map on the right, but those generally correspond to some of the features that you see on the left there. Altering flows within particular portions of this project site to improve sustainability, also doing some dredging for overwintering habitat, but then that also provides material that can be used to raise some of those forested areas up high enough that trees can be planted that can survive at those higher elevations, typically hard mass trees. And then there's island protection and restoration as part of this project. And so with all those project features that I just mentioned, the team then, works through, how many different ways can we combine those things that make sense? And in this case, for the specific example, and I won't get into the details, there's quite a few alternative initially evaluated. There's 31. And ultimately, the team, working through their habitat evaluation and through their costs evaluation, settled on 8 alternatives, and those include the no action. That always has to be one of the options that we have available to us. And I mentioned earlier that cost-effectiveness incremental analysis, and like I said, we could spend an entire webinar just on that. But you see 2 columns there in the table there on the bottom, and those represent the annualized cost. How much does it cost to go build all those features of that particular plan? And that is compared to the outputs, or essentially the habitat benefits. And we have a variety of ways in which we get to the outputs or the habitat benefits. We have a number of models that we use in collaboration with our partners to assess, what's essentially the lift of the project. If we go build this, are we going to get the types of habitat that we would like to see that address the problems, goals, and objectives of the project? And then that whole column on the right of what's cost-effective, what's not cost-effective, what are best buy plans. Essentially, you're comparing those 2 things, the cost and the outputs, in order to determine which ones are the most efficient at providing the kinds of things that we want to see. I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more that goes into that. But in this particular case, the team elected, you see on the right side there's 4 plans identified as best buy plans. So the team really focused in on those 4 plans for further evaluation. And ultimately they settled in on what's identified here as Plan 27, which I'll show you on the next page, or on the next slide, excuse me. So the things on the left are descriptors of all the things on the map on the right that you may not be able to discern too well. But there's a lot of, and this is the plan that, the cost and the benefits are important, but then there's also a conversation that happens by the team and with the sponsors and with the partners on, determining between those 3 or 4 alternatives, which one is the one that's most worth it. And a lot of times the numbers don't always tell you exactly what the clear-cut winner is, and so there's a conversation that has to happen, and that has to be documented. And that's part of what's in the feasibility report, is that decision-making process that the team goes through. And so you can see here the features at Steamboat include island protection and restoration. There's going to be some flow alteration. A big component of this is timber stand improvement, taking existing forested areas and doing some work in there to improve the sustainability of the forest that's there, as well as doing some plantings that will get us some more desirable tree species out into the future. So after the team has kind of worked through those that process, which a lot of times, that takes anywhere between 2 and 3 years to go through that process. Usually about 2. Once they've come to that conclusion about a recommended plan, then we get into this review process that we have as a result of our policy and as a result of law. And there's a number of components in that. Once that feasibility report is drafted, we do an internal quality control review. Well, oftentimes we invite our sponsors to take part in that as well. And that's just really the first comprehensive look at the document to make sure it's telling the story that we want to be told and making the case as well as we can that, hey, this recommendation that we're making is the best it can be. Once that's done, we have a requirement to send this out to what we call agency technical review, and that's a review that happens outside. It's still within the Corps of Engineers, but it's folks from other districts from around the Corps who haven't had a hand in developing the project. We want some independence in that review, and so that usually takes 30 to 45 days. And once those two things are completed, we have a discussion with our division office. We call it the Msc Decision Milestone. The Msc is the Major Subordinate Command, which is Mississippi Valley Division. And we walk through the project, and here's all the decisions we made, and here's why we made them. That's a great opportunity for the sponsor to be involved in that and provide some perspective as we have that discussion. Once we have that meeting and we've got some, the folks at our division office are comfortable, we put that report then out for public review, and we almost always have a public meeting that goes with that, where we gather that input and feedback from the public and make any necessary adjustments to the document that are called for. That will result in a final feasibility report that we send down to our division office for approval. And once that's completed, we can sign the report and we can sign our NEPA document. Finding of no significant impact is usually the vehicle for that. So that entire feasibility process, and including the review, is usually about anywhere between 2.5 to 3 years in total. Obviously, there's projects that run into sticky issues that need to be resolved, and that can go longer, and then some smaller projects that can go quicker. But that's 2.5 to 3 years is about the norm. Oops, and of course I did hit the wrong button. One of the things that we're working on in the program right now is to shorten this review process up. Currently, we do an end-to-end. We do district quality control, agency technical review, we have our milestone meeting, and then we do public review and meetings. And a model that we've adopted elsewhere in the Corps that we would like to move towards in this program is concurrently having that agency technical review, division review, and public review all at the same time. So we can deal with those comments all at once, and we can turn the document around in a lot shorter time frame than what we're doing. Once we've got an approval from our division office, we move then into the pre-construction engineering and design. Sometimes we call this plans and specs. A couple of things that are happening simultaneously during this phase. For projects where we have a federal sponsor such as the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're working on a memorandum of agreement that kind of spells out the relationship that we have on that project. For projects that are sponsored by non-federal interests, states and municipalities and such, we have project partnership agreements. And those are legally binding documents that spell out, here's the relationship between the Corps of Engineers and the non-federal sponsor. Here's how much things cost and the cost share and all that good stuff. And then it also spells out the terms of the operations and maintenance and associated responsibilities. We as a program in the past have signed project partnership agreements, I think with all the states at one time. There's been nationally an issue with project partnership agreements. There's some things in there that folks are asking to be changed, and so there's been discussion in Washington about some of those things, but those are still the vehicles that we have to use by law to partner with a non-federal sponsor. While those negotiations are going on, the plans and specifications, the detailed engineering and technical documents are being put together. As I said, during feasibility, we go about a 35% level of design on our recommended plan. Well, to get it ready for a construction award, we need to round that out to a complete set of engineering drawings and cost estimates. And typically that's simply for the first, a lot of our projects, almost all of our projects end up getting broken up into stages because we simply don't have enough money to build them all at once. And so these plans and specification stages usually correspond to the particular stage that we're in or that we have dollars available for. Some other things that we're doing during that time frame is, continuing any monitoring that we identified during feasibility. There's a review process for those plans and specifications documents that we go through. We do typically engage our sponsors in those reviews as well. And when that's all said and done, when we have a package that's ready to be advertised, we'll end that phase by signing that MOA or the project partnership agreement. And that, of course, then takes us into the construction phase, which is, from a process standpoint, is fairly straightforward. There's a lot of lessons learned and intricacies that we're going to be talking about at the upcoming workshop about how things actually get constructed and some of those challenges. But when we get into construction, the first thing that happens is that if there were any additional lands that needed to be acquired for the project, that takes place first. We do some monitoring during construction, but kind of the heart and soul of this stage is what you see there in the middle for each stage. There's an advertisement, there's a contract award, then we give a notice to proceed to the contractor, and then they're out there physically building the project. The Corps of Engineers Construction Office oversees that work. It's our responsibility under law to oversee that construction stage, but we do that in collaboration with our sponsors. And then finally, when the project that stage is physically complete, we'll do a final inspection and walk through, as well as turn over an operations and maintenance manual for that project. I mentioned earlier where there's monitoring and adaptive management that may go out into the future. We have mechanisms that allow us to do that, both for federal projects and for cost-shared projects. But ultimately, once we get into that operations and maintenance stage, we'll close that project out from a financial standpoint. And then finally, the operations and maintenance phase. This is just a short list of the kinds of things that we're talking about. The day-to-day activities that are required to make sure a project functions. Now, if you're talking about a forest stand improvement where we've gone and done some work, that might be almost next to nothing for quite a few years, or it may include annual inspections to go out and make sure the trees are being successful, and if not, hey, maybe we go plant some additional trees. It may mean if we're operating a pump station, the sponsor, obviously there's costs associated with that that they will need to be, that they're responsible for. But it also includes things like repairs and replacements and rehabilitations, the normal wear and tear that happens on projects over time that need to be addressed. And then finally, we as a program conduct performance evaluation reports. We prepare those. Those have evolved a bit over the life of the program. Those used to be done annually on projects, and after quite a bit of reflection, the value of those has been reconsidered, and so we've been moving towards a model of getting out there on site with all of our partners and the sponsors and taking a look at projects to see if they're performing the way they should, and then making recommendations on adjustments that could be made for those projects. So within the program right now, as of today, we've completed 56 projects over the last 32 years, and we've impacted almost 106,000 acres across the upper Mississippi River system. That represents a pretty large investment. In the last 10 years, that represents more than half of all the wetland acres that have been restored by the Corps of Engineers in the country. So we are, in a lot of ways, this program and this particular element of the program are really at the forefront of large-scale restoration in the nation. Just real quick, we've got, in the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through these next 3 slides, but right now, across the 3 core districts, the geographic regions of the system, we have 17 projects in various stages of planning, design, and construction, and then, of course, we're evaluating. And you can get a sense here of some of these that are in those various stages here in St. Paul District, and then in Rock Island, Steamboat there is the one that I used as an example. Green Island is one that the fact sheet's been approved. It's way back at the very beginning at step 1 of the process. And then we have others, say at St. Louis, such as Ted Shanks and Clarence Cannon, that are in construction. Ted Shanks actually just completed here recently, and that project's being turned over to the sponsor. Clarence Cannon is in construction right now. Just real quick, if you're interested in more information on this or any other topic related to UMRR, you can always go to our webpage. Everything, the link there is at the bottom. Everything, every single project, all 56 of those projects, has their own tab with all the project documents associated with them. Also, as I mentioned a couple of times, the long-term resource monitoring element of the program, that provides a lot of the base science that we use in development of these projects. You can access that through the USGS website. I mentioned earlier the Habitat Needs Assessment 2. That's actually 2 documents that lay out those indicators for ecosystem structure and function that I mentioned. You can see the links there on the sides, but you can also grab those at the program page down below. As I started off by saying, just the HREP part of this program has been going on for 32 years. We have learned a tremendous amount about how these things get planned, how they get designed, and ultimately what ends up getting constructed and how those things function. And we have compiled over time by feature, so the different types of restoration features that we've implemented over time. We've put together a handbook that kind of documents all the lessons learned over that period of time, so that as if we're starting back on step 1, we've got a new project, and the team is thinking through different project features, we can go back and look at, here's every single time we've used that feature, here's how it performed, here's maybe when we have had cases where it didn't perform as well as we thought, here were the conditions, so that the teams can be informed by those lessons that we've learned over time. So that can be found again on our webpage. And then it occurred to me that I left off here. There is a wealth of talent and expertise within the core districts, within our federal partners, and within the states. Folks that have been working on this far longer than I have. And I'm going to put together a list of maybe some of those points of contacts that you can reach out to if you're interested in more about a specific topic related to HREPs. Now that I've left exactly 4 minutes for questions, I apologize for the length of this, but I'll open it up now for questions, and feel free.
All right, Marshall, we have our first question is, let me get, someone's asking about the interagency coordination and early scoping pre-NEPA, and it's, I'm going to switch back to slide 27, number 8.8. So let me get us back there. Slide 1, 2. So the question is related to interagency coordination that you talked about in the project initiation phase.
Right. I think, so that would be, so yeah, when a project's been moved into feasibility to start that process, as when that project delivery team is formed, one of their first jobs is to put together that project management plan, which really lays out that scope. You know, what are the things that we're going to do to accomplish this feasibility study? And that's a good opportunity for our sponsors to be engaged in that scoping of that feasibility report. Obviously, there's things that we have, you know, requirements that we have to comply with in law and in policy that we don't have a lot of flexibility on. But as that document's being put together, that scope of work, that's a great opportunity for our sponsor to be engaged in that. Does that, hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. Next question is asking about, does the Corps always allow other partners, other partners to lead in proposing HREP to the river teams rather than the Corps proposing the projects on their own?
Yes, the intent in both the past identification of HREP projects and what we're proposing later this year, the intent is that that's a collaborative discussion. The intent is not for the Corps to come forward with a list of here's the things that we have that we'd like to work on, and you know, the other partners to do the same. The intent is that there's a conversation that happens around the science that we have available to us about what restoration needs are a priority. And then to have a discussion about that then leads to project proposals.
All right, thanks. Let me check the other website or the other web meeting. Does anyone else have questions for Marshall? We'll switch back to the intro slide. So if you didn't get to mark your check mark before, if you want to make your mark on the state that you're in, and then also what agency you're from. Marshall, did you get any comments or questions that came directly to you?
I did not. Let me double check though.
And again, folks, if you have questions, you're welcome to type them in. If you want to ask them yourself, you could also unmute yourself by hitting *6.
I did not get any questions in the chat.
Okay. All right, well, I guess, folks, you're welcome to stay on the line if you have additional questions to ask of Marshall. If not, I want to show you the webinar schedule we have here. So we're at April 23rd, the HREP 101, and so next week on April 30th, we'll learn about the long-term resource monitoring work that's done on the Upper Miss. Jeff Hauser will be presenting. And then the next day on May 1st, we'll have John Hendrickson from the St. Paul District talking with us about hydrology and hydraulic modeling that's done on the Upper Miss that supports the Upper Mississippi River restoration. So I want to thank you all. We do have, I think we do have one more question here. I'm seeing, okay, the question talked about the large, that these projects are enormous. and says the Corps deserves great credit for navigating the challenges associated with this program. Generally speaking, what's your best guess on the number of Corps employees that play a role in the project from start to finish?
Ooh,
in a project from start.
In a project. Let me think about that for a second. So obviously, we're going to have a lead plan formulator, someone to help facilitate the conversation about alternative developments. We're going to have a biologist or ecologist to help through the NEPA requirements. Typically, we'll have a cultural resources specialist working on that. Usually a project engineer, which coordinates, between civil and structural. It just depends. Engineering kind of depends on which way the team is going in terms of project features. If they're structural things, obviously that's a different skill set than if it's other types of features. So somewhere between 5 and 10, depending on the scope of the project, and some can get bigger depending on the unique circumstances that come up. But I think 5 to 10 is probably a reasonable number, and that involvement varies throughout the feasibility process. Some of those folks are engaged heavily at the beginning, some are more so at the end. And that's just the feasibility stage. When you get into the design, that's a whole different group of folks. Well, not entirely different, but there's additional resources brought to bear to prepare the contract documents and those sorts of things. And then when you get into construction, we have folks that are, that specialize in construction management, that work, their job is to work with the contractors and make sure they're doing the things they're supposed to. So that number will fluctuate as you move throughout the project, and the disciplines will change as you move throughout the project.
All right, thanks a lot, Marshall. Again, if you have any additional questions, type them in the chat, and we'll try and get them answered and post them as with our question and answer postings. We will be sharing the slide set from here on the website that Marshall indicated on the UMR website under key initiatives. And so we're hoping to share this slide deck for others to learn from in the future. And then we hope you will join us for the remaining 2 webinars next week. Thanks a lot. And great job, Marshall.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Appreciate it.